Hi class, this is your instructor, Skylar Huff. So I'm here to help you all review for your ensuing test. Please bear in mind that the lectures that have been posted should be listened to. In addition to listening to those lectures, I would hope that by now all of you all have taken notes on those lectures. If you have not, please do so because there is a test that ensues. I'll now begin. The review shall begin in the 29th chapter. To aid in your review, I recommend you have your lecture notes that you have taken, as well as those lecture presentations found posted at Canvas. I say again, please now have out your lecture notes, as well as the lecture presentations posted to Canvas. That way you can follow along well. To begin the chapter, keep in mind that this is the kingdom called fungi, and the fungi that exist were once grouped with the plants. One thing being evidence would be those sharing cell walls. So yes, I said both plants and fungi share cell walls. However, fungi are wholly different, so they're no longer grouped together. What is similar in both plants and fungi is that fungi are eukaryotic. And when I say they're eukaryotic, I mean that they are eukaryotic heterotrophs. And the way in which they gain their nutrition is by secreting their digestive enzymes. Hence, I'll call them saprobes. So those cells I mentioned earlier, having cell walls, are made of a carbohydrate called chitin. So yes, the fungi have cell walls, which are composed of chitin. Most fungi are multicellular, except those unicellular yeasts. The yeasts reproduce by way of budding. It's asexual. So as the fungi are, typical of which is for the fungi to form a mold. And when I refer to a mold, I'm referring to a mycelium. So the mycelium is the mold itself, and it's composed of hyphae, which is plural for the term hypha. So as it happens, those hypha can be either coenocytic, having no septa, having many nuclei per hypha cell, or they could of course be non-coenocytic hypha, or septated hypha. The fungi reproduce, or at least reproduce via spores. And when I say they reproduce via spores, it's spores that are going to be dispersed via the wind, water, and even animals, such as myself after I found the mushroom in my apartment a while ago. So the spores are haploid spores, and the spores are produced on the sporangium. So that diploid sporangium is what produces those haploid spores. The fungi reproduce both asexually as well as sexually. And just keep in mind that the plants evolved first, then thereafter came fungi, and after fungi came us, being animals. So from there, we went through differing groups of fungi, and of course, a bit of evolutionary information on the fungi. Please keep in mind that there were differing groups such as the chytrids from Chytridiomycota, which were those that are aquatic and contribute to declining amphibian populations. There were glomeromycetes from Glomeromycota. As I mentioned Glomeromycota, those were referred to as being those arbuscular fungi, in that it's the glomeromycetes that are here and contributing to the way in which plants can more efficiently uptake water and minerals. And the plant, of course, provides the fungus with its nutrition by way of those organic components, particularly sugars. Thereafter, we had gotten then to Zygomycota, and in Zygomycota, you all learned that, of course, it includes black bread mold, which is Rhizopus sporangia. It includes black bread mold, which is Rhizopus stolonifer. And I mentioned that it produces spores both asexually as well as sexually. However, those sexual spores in phylum Zygomycota are referred to as being zygospores. Those are particularly, pretty dangerous spores to be around. Thereafter, we got on into other things such as why it is important throughout the lecture. And then we got to the next being Ascomycota, which are the cup fungi. And in Ascomycota, you learned that it includes Poziza, the cup fungus, in which we also saw in lab. Thereafter, we got down to ways in which they reproduce. So we got to penicillin because by way of that example, which you all also saw in lab, they produce spores asexually, and those asexual spores are known as conidia. So it's the conidia that are produced asexually in Ascomycota, whereas those sexual spores of Ascomycota are referred to as being ascospores. So you have the ascocarp, which of course has the ascus or the asci, and of course from such things you see all of those ascospores as they are produced. Please see that in your textbook. And then thereafter we got to the club fungi. Basidiomycota it is. So the basidiomycetes, as I state, these, of course, produce basidiospores. Particularly, these include the mushrooms, the puffballs, rusts, and smuts, and even the shelf fungi. And then we got into why fungi are important both economically and ecological, which, of course, is on your test. Please be prepared to explain each of those with an example of each, meaning an actual fungus example. So, economically, the fungi are wholly important, meaning I'll be making Papa's pizza for Chancellor and the family tomorrow. I'll do that by way of those things we know as Saccharomyces cerevisiae, meaning yeasts. So by using those yeasts, you can make dough, as well as bread, and a number of other things, not to mention alcohol, which of course is worth billions of dollars. That's just one example. Another way to go about this is ecologically. Ecologically, the fungi that inhabit the guts allow those huge ruminants to, of course, eat grass and be able to digest that cellulose cell wall, whereas we cannot because we lack that fungus. The very same way termites can digest lignin, meaning those lignified fibers that are found that are also strong and allowing this computer to be on this table or this desk right now. But of course, it is due to the fungi that can be broken down. And not just that, but they also break down animal carcasses. So at some point over the rainbow, if ever you become one to, of course, I guess I'll say hunt, or if you ever have to hit some, I guess I'll say animal with your vehicle, not to mention just those, but also the things known as dinosaurs which once roamed the earth. All those things that have died will be broken down, of course, by some fungi, or at least the fungi themselves. So they are able to, of course, enable us to recycle nutrients. So one time the tree had fallen in the woods, and I don't know if you heard it before, meaning the tree that fell. But of course, as those trees fall, they will directly be broken down, of course, by fungi. From there, we moved on to the 33rd chapter. And in this chapter, we learned about what are known as those three basic plant tissue systems. So that's where it began, and the rest of the chapter dealt with the plant tissues. So keeping in mind what's happening here, the plant body, it's made up of two things, the root and shoot system. So the root system is underground, where the soil is dark and moist, and there the nutrients are uptaken, called water and minerals. Next up is the shoot system. The shoot system is there by way of that vertical stem, the leaves, and in flowering plants it includes flowers, fruits, and seeds. So this part of the plant is illuminated as opposed to, of course, the dark area, and the former being the root system. And there's dry air, the nutrients here be, of course, sunlight and carbon dioxide. So now I'll get to the namesake, meaning on your test you all will describe or repeat those three tissue systems, and each of those with two or more tissue types. So the three tissue systems are as follows: ground tissue system, which functions to photosynthesize, store, and support. The vascular tissue system, which is an intricate conducting system, conducting water and minerals, including food in the form of sugar, but it also strengthens and supports. And finally is that dermal tissue system. So it is that covering for the plant body. So from there I got to organs of plants, meaning organs of plants are roots, stems, leaves, flower parts, and fruits. And it's because each is composed of all three tissue systems. From there we got directly into the ground tissue system. Here, what we saw in lap were parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma, meaning those three types of tissues. So the parenchyma cells have a thin primary cell wall. It makes up the soft parts of the plant, such as the edible part of an apple or the potato, and it functions to photosynthesize, store, and secrete. Up next was collenchyma. The collenchyma cells have the unevenly thickened primary cell walls. However, it's extremely flexible. So here, that structured tissue is support for those non-woody plant organs, meaning those herbaceous parts, So those individual plant cells are what provide the structural support, such as in the strings of celery. Since we saw that in lab, we saw the parenchyma cells in the celery stalk as we pulled the strings off. Up next are sclerenchyma cells. They have both primary cell walls and thick secondary cell walls. So it's that secondary cell wall that becomes strong and hard, and it's because of extreme thickening. The sclerids. Sclerids are cells in the shells of nuts and the stones of fruit, meaning those stony fruit, such as the cherry and the peach. So it also includes those, I guess I'll say pears, meaning the gritty texture of pears. So it's clusters of sclerids that make the pear have that gritty texture. From there we got into cell wall chemistry, and I made it plain. Cellulose, which is that most abundant polymer in the world, accounts for approximately 60% of the dry weight of plant cell walls. Lignin is an important component of the secondary cell walls, and particularly of those of wood. So it's a strengthening polymer and is therefore conduction, but it's amazingly well and how it works. Next up was the vascular tissue system, in which there are two complex tissues, xylem and phloem. Xylem conducts water and minerals up from the roots to the stems and ultimately the leaves, and provides structural support. Within the xylem are found tracheids as well as vessel elements. Those are two types of cells, you all. So what they do is conduct water and minerals. So by way of apoptosis, it becomes hollow, and of course, it's transported using no energy. It's a passive process. We'll get to this further in subsequent chapters. Up next is the phloem. So the phloem conducts carbohydrates created during photosynthesis down from leaves to stems to roots, and of course it provides structural support. So here there are two cells known as the sieve tube elements and companion cells. They work in concert to transport food materials. So the sieve tube elements, they are alive at maturity, but many organelles shrink and disintegrate. Whereas our companion cells, however, they are what is directing activity linked by plasmodesmata. Up next is the dermal tissue system. So it has two complex tissues, the epidermis and periderm. So I'll say that these tissues provide a protective covering over plant parts. So herbaceous plants have a single layer of epidermis. Woody plants, they have an epidermal layer and a periderm or woody layer, that outer bark. So the epidermis, it is transparent, made of those unspecialized cells, and of course there are guard cells there too. You may also find trichomes there, which are, they're like hair, so I'll say they're hair-like, and they allow light to penetrate to the interior tissues. I say again, the epidermis, which is transparent, made up of those unspecialized cells, allows light to penetrate to the interior photosynthetic tissues. So those cells also secrete a waxy cuticle to help retard water loss. Stomata facilitate the diffusion of carbon dioxide and oxygen. So stomata are made up of two guard cells, and they are typically open during the day. And one other thing that does indeed diffuse would be water vapor. Water vapor also leaves the stomata. The periderm. The periderm forms under the epidermis, providing a new protective covering as the epidermis is destroyed as woody plants increase in girth. So it forms the outer bark of older stems and roots. So it's composed mostly of cork cells. Those cork cells are also coated with suberin, which is a waterproofer, as well as cork parenchyma. Next, we got to plant meristems. So as plant cells grow, they grow in very specific areas. We as animals, we have growth, and it occurs all over the body, but of course at different rates. So meristematic growth occurs via mitosis and can occur throughout the lifespan of plants. So indeterminate plants, their growth, of course, occurs by way of, at stems and roots. So they grow throughout the plant's life. Whereas with determinate growth, we have leaves and flowers, for examples. They stop growing after reaching a certain size. So we now have two types of meristematic growth. They're known as primary growth and secondary growth. I'll begin with primary growth. It occurs in all plants and it increases root stem length. So, and I'll put it this way, it's the entire herbaceous plant or just the young, soft shoots of woody plants. Up next, secondary growth. So I would say here it includes those woody dicots and gymnosperms, and this is what increases in girth of a plant. It's woody and bark. So with primary growth, it occurs at apical meristems, at the tips of roots and shoots, and buds too. So roots, they have those apical meristems that are beneath the root cap, and then we also have the shoot apex, as well as the terminal bud, and the leaf primordia, which is that developing leaf bud. So nextly, we'll get to secondary growth, which occurs at lateral meristems. So there are two lateral meristems that exist. It's called the vascular cambium and cork cambium. They are the ones responsible for secondary growth. They are the secondary growth tissues. So we have secondary xylem as well as secondary phloem and the periderm too. I'll begin with the vascular cambium. The vascular cambium, it has meristematic cells that form a thin continuous cylinder within the stem and root. So this is between the wood and bark. So the division of cells in the vascular cambium adds more cells to the wood and the inner bark. Formally, I say the secondary xylem, that wood, and the inner bark, the secondary phloem. The cork cambium is that thin cylinder or that irregular arrangement of meristematic cells, and this is in the bark. So it's the cells of the cork cambium that divide and form the cork cells to the outside, and the periderm, which of course is that cork cambium, the cork cells, and cork parenchyma. So I'll get to bark. To help you all with bark, it is simply just all plant tissues that are outside the vascular cambium. And then from there, we moved on to the 27th chapter, the seedless plants. To help you on the test, what you will be tasked with doing is to contrast, to describe, to tell everything there is about those four extant groups of plants. They are as follows: bryophytes, seedless vascular plants, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. To begin the chapter, I'll put it as being the seedless plants. Yes, we've finally got to plants on land. Well, the way in which plants began were in the ocean. And as they moved from being that green algae that was aquatic to being that terrestrial plant, they had to, of course, adapt. So the two major evolutionary adaptations were A, the waxy cuticle, as well as B, an ability to capture atmospheric carbon. So up next, on your test, what you all will do is label the alternation of generations for plants. And of course, all plants alternate between a haploid gametophyte and diploid sporophyte generation. So from that sporophyte that is diploid, it goes through meiosis to produce those haploid spores. They go through mitosis to form that gametophyte generation. From there, by way of mitotic divisions, sperm cells are produced as well as an egg. From there, fertilization occurs, making that zygote, that diploid zygote generation, and of course it continues to divide by way of mitotic divisions to form another diploid sporophyte generation. This happens in all plants. So just keep in mind, via the gametophyte generation, of course, that the antheridia is what produces a sperm, and the archegonia is what produces an egg. So there is a multicellular haploid stage and a multicellular diploid stage. I'll begin now with bryophytes, the first of four groups of plants still in existence today. So they have no vascular tissues. They are small, requiring a moist environment. I'll begin now with the mosses more specifically. They're typically found in dense colonies or beds. An approximate 10,000 species exist, 9,900 to 10,000 species. And each plant has a rhizoid, that absorptive structure, with a leaf-like blade, or leaf-like blades rather. So there is no vascular tissue. Along that, there are no true roots, no stems, or leaves. Please see that life cycle. So many species have different sexes. That antheridium and of course that archegonium. And some are on the same plant. So that green moss gametophyte, of course, produces the gametangia on the plant itself, on the top of the plant itself. And then keep in mind that water is required for fertilization. And it's happened by way of course, raindrops that are splash or even flowing water. So the sporophyte generation is dependent upon the dominant gametophyte generation. So the gametophyte is always there. Hence, it's dominant in the bryophytes. So the sporophyte is initially green, and then it becomes a golden brown color, as it is there from the foot to the seta or stalk, and even to the capsule that produces the spores. So again, I'll state the gametophyte is dominant, and it's independent of that sporophyte generation. Please know the importance of each of those. The liverworts include an approximate 6,000 species. They have those flattened lobed structures, hence they're referred to as being thalloid or leafy. The gametophyte generation is still dominant. There are no leaves, stems, or roots. So it's thallus, meaning that thallus or the thalli, which look like a human liver. The rhizoids are now on the underside of that thallus, and they anchor the plant to the soil. So like the mosses, those, in quotations, leaves consist of a single layer of undifferentiated cells. So this is a small, inconspicuous plant in damp or moist environments. So they go both ways as far as being sexual and asexually reproducing by way of the archegonia and the antheridia. The life cycle here is the same as mosses. However, I will say that some liverworts have archegoniophores and antheridophores. The sporophyte here is still dependent upon that dominant gametophyte generation. So here, what's different is that in asexual reproduction, they happen to do it with what are called gemma. Gemma are tiny balls which are inside a gemma cup. So as a raindrop or water is dispersed, the gemma, of course, allow for reproduction. It is asexual. Next up are the hornworts. It is an approximate 100 species that exist. They resemble the thalloid liverworts, and they are typically in disturbed areas such as roadsides and fields. They have a single large chloroplast per cell, and of course, and they are many in disc-shaped in the liverworts and mosses. So I'll leave it at that as far as the hornworts are concerned. I'll next get to the seedless vascular plants. So the key word here is vascular. They still have no seeds, but what they have evolved now are vascular tissues. So the vascular tissues, i.e. xylem and phloem, allows water, minerals, and sugar to be transported to all parts of the plant. And they do also have what are called true stems, true leaves, and most have roots. And of course, they have vascular tissues. So we have two basic types of true leaves. They're known as microfields and megafields. The microfields have one small, well, they are small, and they have one vascular strand. I say again, microfields, they're small and they have one vascular strand, one vein, you all. And these are found in the club mosses. Whereas the megafields are that more common leaf, and these are found, of course, in angiosperms, gymnosperms, and even the ferns. I'll put it as being most leaves we know and see today. The club mosses. They're from phylum Lycopodiophyta, and they're an approximate 1,200 species. They're small, they resemble conifers or even ferns, with true roots, with a rhizome, meaning that horizontal underground stem, erect stems, and scale-like leaves known as microfields. The sporangia are borne on cone-like strobilus, or a cone-like strobili to be plural, and they are evergreen. Ferns. The ferns are from phylum Trophyta. It is an approximate 11,000 species. They are both terrestrial and aquatic. Keeping in mind here, the sporophyte, you all, is now that dominant generation in the seedless vascular plants and every other group of plants except, of course, the bryophytes. I say again, please keep in mind that the dominant generation is the sporophyte generation. It is dominant here in the seedless vascular plants and every other group of plants we'll get to. So the sporophyte is that it contains the rhizome, which is a horizontal underground stem, that bears leaves, known as fronds. So they begin curled up as a fiddlehead. And many species bear their sporangia in sori or in a sorus by way of course, the underside of the leaf. The gametophyte, it is no longer dominant. I just said it. I'll say it again. The sporophyte is the dominant generation. So the prothallus is what begins here, and it lacks vascular tissues. It's green and then produces the orgonium and the antheridium. And for those that may wonder about the gametophyte here, since it's no longer dominant, it's about half the size of your fingernail. So it's pretty small, quite reduced here. So water is still needed for fertilization because they have flagellate sperm. The whisk ferns have an approximate 12,000 species, and they are simple. They lack true leaves, roots, and of course they do have a vascular stem. And the example of a whisk fern is Psilotum nudum with dichotomous branching. Up next are the horsetails. There are approximately 15 horsetail species from the genus Ecosydum. They get to be an approximate 4 feet tall. They have hollow, true stems with, of course, roots and very small leaves. So they are reduced and they are whorled. The green stem is photosynthetic, and the non-reproductive stems resemble a horse's tail. So they were used back in days prior as the scouring rush to screw up pots and pans. But of course, we now use, I guess I suppose, something different to screw up pans these days. So each reproductive branch has a terminal cone-like strobilus, and of course they bear spores in a circle. The life cycle here is very similar to the fern, and the sporophyte is still dominant and independent of that small gametophyte. Still and yet, water is required for fertilization because they have flagellate sperms. So I'll get here and I'll mention that some ferns and club mosses are heterosporous. And being heterosporous meaning they produce two types of spores. So certain ferns and club mosses, including spike mosses too. So the way in which we get to this, and I'll explain this now, and please pay attention you all, is first things first, is by way of the microsporangia. So the microsporangia is what produces that microspore mother cell, and via meiosis it produces those microspores, which by way of that male gametophyte in the antheridia produces those sperm cells, the megaspore. So the way in which it occurs, the megasporangia produces the megaspore mother cell. From there we get megaspores, and then on that female gametophyte, by way of the archegonia, we get the egg. If you're wondering why I mentioned this, the reason it's mentioned is after fertilization, we get that new sporophyte, the new generation. So heterospory characterizes the two most successful groups of plants, gymnosperms and angiosperms, both of which produce seeds. So this is why it is, I say, so important to know. What I'll get to now will be there. Yeah, getting now to the 28th chapter. I was going to go somewhere else, but let's get to it. Chapter 28. To introduce such a chapter, what I'll say is that the bryophytes and seedless vascular plants, yes, they use spores to disperse and germinate. Gymnosperms and angiosperms also produce spores, but they are dispersed by seeds. So that is an adaptation for life on land. If you're wondering what I mean, well, life on land is harsh. You were taught, of course, that desiccation was a major part of why it's so harsh for animals, well, the very same is the case in plants. So seeds are reproductively superior to spores for several reasons. I'll begin now with number one. So seeds are further along in its development and able to survive on its own with an embryonic plant. I repeat, with an embryonic young plant with a root, stem, and one or more leaves. 2, an abundant food supply. Yes, within each of those seeds you've seen in your lives, even if it was just a mustard seed, that seed contained all of those. In addition, what's in that seed? I say is the next portion, being number 3, that protection by a multicellular seed coat. So to put it this way, the reason that seeds are so superior to those things called spores is because they have an entire plant within them, with a root, a stem, and one or more leaves, an abundant food supply, and that protection by a multicellular seed coat derived from integument. How amazing is that? Next up, I'll say that, meaning to further introduce the chapter, like bryophytes and the seedless vascular plants, the seed plants have life cycles that alternate, i.e., the alternation of generations, spending part of their life as a multicellular sporophyte, that is diploid of course, and part in that multicellular gametophyte generation. And please keep in mind that it has not changed. And you say, what is it? It being that the dominant generation is still going to be the sporophyte generation. I'll continue. So what I'll put here is that the gametophyte is reduced in size, so reduced that now it's microscopic and dependent upon that sporophyte. So the seed plants are heterosporous, meaning they produce 2 types of spores. This is required for the production of seeds. So it includes, of course, both that microspore and megaspore. Seed plants produce ovules, each of which is a megasporangium surrounded by integument. So the seed plants are divided into 2 groups. And of course, this is based upon whether an ovary wall surrounds the ovules. They are as follows: the gymnosperms and angiosperms. I'll begin with the former. Gymnosperms are known as the naked seed plants. Those seeds are born exposed on scales of cones, and no ovary wall surrounds the ovule. Examples of which include the redwood, the pine, the spruce, and the fir. And I was watching a documentary a couple of years ago, and I was so amazed to find out that redwood can grow 6 feet in 1 year. That amazed me, so much so. And of course, it takes at least 10 years for the cone just to, of course, mature. So you're saying, what do you mean there, Huff? I mean that it takes 10 years for a cone to become mature and produce those seeds. So with that, there are redwood trees that are alive today that were alive. I would just put it as being a long, long time ago. Meaning even before AD began. There are redwood trees today you could go see in California that were alive then. How amazing is that? So the angiosperms, they are flowering plants with seeds enclosed within a fruit, the matured ovary. So the ovules here are protected. And I guess I'll put as being examples are as follows, such as the cactus, the apple, the grass, the oak, corn, and just keep in mind that both of which have xylem and phloem. So what I'll get to nextly is, for seed plants to evolve, a lot had to occur. So all seed plants have that produce gametophyte. They produce 2 types of spores. They are heterosporous. And I'll go back to that gametophyte because I thought of something. Yes, the gametophyte is now microscopic. They produce ovules, known as seeds, and they have pollen. I said again, pollen. So these adaptations provided new ways for seed plants to cope with those harsh terrestrial conditions here on Earth. And you say, what do you mean? Well, exposure to ultraviolet radiation. It's hot. Drought. There's a drought going on right now. And these novel adaptations also freed seed plants from requiring water for fertilization. So that reduced gametophyte, of course, is reduced so much so that it's now microscopic. You cannot see it. And please keep in mind that I'm giving you information on these plants that I would say is good to know. Being heterosporous, that production of two types of spores is needed for the production of seeds. Without it, you can't get seed. So as it occurs, you have, of course, the microsporangium, the megaspore, their integuments, and that is what is called an ovule. So the gymnosperms have one integument that surrounds, and the angiosperm has two integuments. So let's go from pollen to seed. That microspore develops into a pollen grain that consists of an immature male gametophyte. So pollen grains are transported by wind or by animals, and the transfer of pollen to the part of the seed plant that contains the ovule is called pollination. So the sperm of seed plants do not require motility or water because the sperm are carried directly to the eggs by pollen. So if a sperm fertilizes an egg of a seed plant, the zygote will grow into a sporophyte embryo. So I'll now begin keeping in mind, these are the gymnosperms I'll begin with. So as we've done things in the class thus far, we have now made our way through a number of phyla. We've made our way through 8 phyla, and we're knocking out now the 9th and 10th plant phylum. So it's 10 extant animal phyla. Let us now begin with the gymnosperms. 4 phyla here are included. They are called cycadophyta, which includes the cycads, ginkophyta, including that gingo. Thereafter is gnetophyta, which includes the gnetophytes, and lastly coniferophyta, which includes the conifers. Let us begin. So I'll start here firstly with the cycads from Cycadophyta. They are the next to largest group of gymnosperms, next to the conifers. They have large cones and palm-like leaves, but they are not palm trees at all. So those sago palms are not at all, of course, those sago palms are not at all angiosperms, meaning the true palm trees are angiosperms, which flower and fruit. So the sago palms are nothing more than cycads. They bear cones with seeds. An approximate 130 species survive today. Next up is Ginkgophyta from ginkgo. Only one species exists. It's called Ginkgo biloba. It has beautiful fan-like leaves that turn gold in autumn. I love seeing these since I planted those in the Huff's yard, and it's popular in cities because it can tolerate pollution quite well. It is often those that are planted in areas such as these are the ones that produce pollen, because the others of which that produces those fleshy seeds smell, I say, putrid. They're the worst of which, so please know which one you're planting. Up next is Gnetophyta. That includes 3 genera. They are Netum, Ephedra, and Welwitschia. Welwitschia is found on the continent of Africa in those southwestern deserts. It's amazing how this plant can grow in a desert, thanks to evolution. From there we get to Netum. It's a tropical tree, including some shrubs and vines, native to Africa again, and of course Asia, and the leaves look similar to those in the flowering plants. But the seeds are what look like fruits, but they are not. And lastly, I'll get down to Ephedra, and here there are 40 species, and these are in arid regions, some arid regions, but of course you can find some in the desert. And one that is quite common is called Mormon tea, the common name, and it produces ephedrine, which is used as a decongestant. Amazing how plants can provide so much to us. Next up is Coniferophyta. So it's the largest phylum of gymnosperms, consisting of an approximate 600 species. So I already mentioned some of which, such as the redwood, the dawn redwood, and even the bald cypress. Those two are deciduous trees, and they lose their leaves each fall, each autumn. During winter, the gymnosperms, the conifers especially, since they are evergreen, as most of them are, they even conduct photosynthesis in the winter, the dead of winter. And a few conifer species, they dominate those vast forested regions of the northern hemisphere. So these include many large trees, such as those redwoods, cypresses, and not just redwoods and cypresses, but also the giant sequoia and even the bristlecone pine. Up next, we get to the angiosperms. Angiosperms are known as the flowering plants. It's so many of these that I would say that they include an approximate 90% of all plants. That approximate 90% of all plants are flowering plants. So I say it includes an approximate 300,000 species. So they're commonly known as the flowering plants, the angiosperms are, and they reproduce using flowers and fruit. So the seeds are contained in fruit, the matured ovary. So from here, what I'll get to is that please keep in mind this phylum, being Anthophyta, has the two most paramount adaptations are A, flowers, and B, fruit. So as I continue here, let's look at that flower structure. I'll begin with that outermost whorl, the outermost whorl. So to start there, the flower includes those things called sepals. Sepals. Well, as I mentioned those sepals, the sepals are typically green on the outside, and as those sepals are, they are there to protect the developing bud. I say again, those sepals are there to protect the developing bud. From there, I'll get to the next whorl, and the next whorl includes those things known as petals. So the petals are there to attract animal pollinators, if in fact the flower is showy. I say again, showy flowers have petals, and those petals are there to attract animal pollinators. In the event that the flower is not a showy flower, then of course that would be there and not being attracted to any animal pollinator. The next whorl in would be the thing we know as the stamen. So the stamen is made up of two parts, the anther and filament. The filament, of course, is what holds that anther, and the anther is what produces pollen. The anther is what produces the pollen. The innermost whorl is known as the carpel or pistil, P-I-S-T-I-L, you all. So I'll begin from top to bottom. The top class is the stigma. I call it the sticky stigma. It's that receptive region for the pollen. From there, of course, is the style, and leading down into the ovary, which would include those immature ovules. This is flower structure. On your test, please also prepare yourselves to describe the process of double fertilization. Let me begin. Double fertilization occurs. As it does occur, you must, of course, have two sperm cells. And along the same note, you must also have those two polynuclei. Let us begin. One sperm cell fertilizes the egg. So again, I said you have two sperm cells, two polynuclei, and of course the egg. One sperm cell fertilizes the egg. That forms the diploid zygote. The other sperm cell fertilizes the two haploid nuclei. This is producing a triploid cell. As it happens, of course, we have A, a zygote, and B, a triploid cell. To help you with your test, and what you all would let me know about the test, meaning the importance of this, is that zygote that was made in that first fertilization event will develop into that sporophyte embryo. And that, of course, will ultimately have either one or two seed leaves, meaning one or two cotyledons. It would also, of course, have a root. In other words, you all, that first fertilization event creates the embryonic plant with a root, a stem, and one or two leaves, called cotyledons. The second fertilization event, at least as I've described it, would make that triploid endosperm. You're saying, what do you mean here? Well, it develops into the endosperm, which is that tissue that's rich in starch and other food reserves that nourishes that developing embryo. I'll put it like this. I saw my son and my spouse plant seeds the other day. Well, what happened is this. As those seeds imbibe water, as those seeds soak up the water, active metabolism begins. As active metabolism began, it's this endosperm that is providing that embryonic plant with the nutrients it needs to, of course, survive. And, of course, ultimately germinate before it can go through photosynthesis. To foreshadow a bit, the figure in your text that shows the life cycle for angiosperms will be on your final exam. Not this exam that's coming up called Test 4 or Test 2. Whatever test it is, a test. I'll next get down to monocots and dicots, or monocots and eudicots. They can be called either the two. I say they're more or less the same term. It depends upon who's teaching the course. So differences among those things. Monocots have flower parts in multiples of 3s. Dicots or eudicots have flower parts in 4s or 5s. Monocots, leaf venation, parallel veins. Eudicots have netted veins or net-like veins. The stem cross-section, I'm going down to vascular bundles. So vascular bundles and stem cross-sections. The monocot has scattered vascular bundles, whereas dicots have vascular bundles that are in a concentric ring or in a concentric circle, rather. The roots of monocot are fibrous. They spread not too deep, as opposed to that main taproot seen in eudicots. Seed leaves. Monocots have a single seed leaf. They have one cotyledon, as opposed to the dicots. The eudicots, they have 2 cotyledons. Monocots have no secondary growth. Secondary growth is absent in monocots, and dicots typically have secondary growth. The eudicots do. So from here, what I'll say is I cannot ask you all everything on the test. Never will I try to ask everything on a test. However, if you have been studying, as I say students should, there is nothing on the test that I can ask you that you won't know if you have been studying. And studying is not just listening to a video. Studying is not just opening a textbook with a cellular phone out. Studying involves active time with your notes, with your textbook, and the presentations posted to Canvas. And of course, active participation in lectures, or even stopping by during office hours, or calling via my office telephone number, or emailing even, to clarify anything that's not clear. So if there are any further questions, please, class, reach out to ask so I can provide you all the assistance that you need. If you have no questions, I understand. However, you all should never hesitate to ask. So to ensure that you all know, keep in mind on the test, what I'll ask of you will be from fungi. I'll ask you all to describe, you'll be told to describe the economic as well as the ecological importance of the fungi with an example of course, what you're stating. Meaning you should have named examples of each of those things. From there we got to the 33rd chapter with the plant tissue systems. I'll ask you to describe those completely. The ground tissue system, the vascular tissue system, and the dermal tissue system. From there we got into the plants. So please keep in mind that I've posted to Canvas, or even handed out to some of you all, the life cycle of the fern. You all will label the life cycle of the fern. You all will label the fern life cycle. You should see number 1 and all those things there. Number 2 with everything there. Number 4, D. Number 7, only. 8 and 9, only. And number 10. And I'm telling you all this to ensure you all know what to expect. And please keep in mind that you all will also describe those 4 extant groups of plants. And please keep in mind that you should be able to tell me those major parts of why these plants are important. And if you say, what do you mean by the major parts? Well, is there a dominant sporophyte or is it a dominant gametophyte? You should be able to give me 2 named examples of each of those 4 types of plant groups. Does it produce spores? Is it homosporous? Is it heterosporous? Is it a plant that produces flowers? Is it seedless? Is it vascular? So please prepare yourselves to perform on the test. And if ever you have a question, as I said earlier, please let me know. Prepare well, class. This has been your instructor, Scholar Huff. Thank you all for listening, class.